Okay, good morning, everyone from the Peace Research Institute Oslo, PRIA, and welcome to this webinar on Norway and the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the UN Security Council. And we are going to discuss what Norway has achieved on this particular agenda thus far, a little more than a year into the 2-year term as member of the Security Council. My name is Torunn Tryggestad, and I'm the director of the PRIO Center on Gender, Peace and Security, and I will be the moderator of today's event. First, a couple of things under housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on our webpage, the PRIO GPS Center webpage, and also the PRIO webpage. And there will be a Q&A session towards the end. Unfortunately, questions can only be posted in the chat, but we will do our best to moderate and forward the questions to the experts on the panel. Now, when Norway launched its candidacy for a non-permanent membership of the UN Security Council for the period 2021 to 2022, 4 thematic areas were highlighted as particularly important for Norway to pursue if elected. And these were peace diplomacy, inclusion of women, protection of civilians, and climate change and security. And the selection of peace diplomacy and women's inclusion as priority themes did not come as a surprise to those of us who have observed Norwegian foreign policy for a while. These have been 2 topics very high on the agenda for many years already, and Norway can, I would argue, show to substantial experience and achievements on both as a norm entrepreneur on these issue areas and in diplomatic practice. So in a way, I think it's fair to say that Norway in many ways have had a comparative advantage to many other countries in advancing these 2 issue areas in the Security Council. In this webinar, we will focus particularly on the issue of women's inclusion, or what is better known as the Women, Peace and Security agenda. However, it is difficult to discuss this agenda without also addressing the issue of peace diplomacy. These 2 issue areas are closely intertwined. Women's inclusion in all matters of international peace and security, and maybe particularly in conflict prevention and peace building, is at the core of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Women's inclusion in peace mediation should become routine and not an add-on to be saved for later. This is the core mantra, in a way, of this agenda. And as many of you probably know already, Norway has been a champion of the Women, Peace and Security agenda since the mid-1990s, even before this was coined as an agenda in its own right. And also before the adoption in October 2000 of the groundbreaking UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security. Norway was also the 2nd country in the world to adopt a national action plan on the implementation of Resolution 1325 back in 2006. And in recent years, Norway has also made efforts to integrate the Women, Peace and Security agenda in its numerous peace engagements around the world, most notably in the Colombia peace process. So when Norway entered the UN Security Council in January 2021, I think it's fair to say that there were high expectations among women's civil society organizations, policymakers and practitioners as to what Norway could do and achieve to advance this agenda. It was expected that Norway would pick up the baton from Sweden, which during its membership during the period 2017 to 18 was explicit about its ambition to make women, peace and security and the implementation of this agenda core business at the UN Security Council. A little more than halfway through the 2-year term, it is therefore now time to pause and look back on Norway's achievements thus far. What has actually Norway done in terms of advancing the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the Council? And has Norway lived up to expectations? Are we perhaps naive to think that a small country like Norway can achieve much at all as a member of the UN Security Council, and maybe especially now as the working relationship between the major powers are frosty, to put it mildly? With us here today, we have a distinguished panel of experts to discuss these topics. We have André Mundal, who is the Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have Louise Olson, who is the Senior Researcher and Research Director here at PRIO. We have Sanam Naraghi Anderlini, Director of the Centre for Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics, and we have a number of other hats. I will come back to that. And we have Niels Nagelhus Schia, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, also known as NUPI. We will start out with you, André, and you will talk for about 15 minutes to provide us a rough summary of what Norway has achieved, at least from the point of view of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during this first year, and maybe also particularly what you did in January when Norway held the presidency of the UN Security Council. But before I give the floor to you, just a few words about you so people know a little bit more about who you are. As Special Representative on Women, Peace and Security, André is responsible for the coordination of the implementation of this agenda in Norway's foreign policy, and particularly also in relation to as a priority topic now as Norway is on the Security Council. And he is also coordinating a number of follow-up activities when it comes to the implementation of Norway's National Action Plan. Before he took up the position as Special Envoy or a Special Representative, he was responsible for women's rights and gender equality in Norwegian foreign and development policy more broadly. And he has been posted 8 years abroad at the Norwegian Embassy in Washington, D.C., at the consulate in Rio de Janeiro, and at the Norwegian Embassy in Kabul. So he has quite a broad experience from Norwegian missions abroad. Before joining the MFA, he also had 11 years of experience from the Norwegian Army. So it's not often we have people with that kind of background moving into the women, peace and security issue area. So that's quite interesting. And he's been working on these issues also and engaging in these issues while he was in the army. In terms of academic background, he holds a Bachelor in Military Studies and Leadership from the Norwegian Military Academy, a Master's of Arts in International Relations from the University of New South Wales, and a Master of Arts in Peace and Conflict Transformation from the Peace Center at the University in Tromsø. So a very varied background indeed. Now I will leave the floor to you, André, and we are excited and to hear what you have to say about Norway on the UN Security Council. So the floor is yours, André.
Thank you so much, Torunn, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. When Torunn told me I had 15 minutes, when she said that to me a couple of weeks ago, I thought that was forever. And then I started writing and I'm like, oh, how am I going to get everything put down on paper? But I'm happy to be here. And so the question is, to what extent has Norway meaningfully strengthened the Women, Peace and Security agenda through our membership in the Security Council? So look, first of all, I want to say that I'm glad to say that I feel good about our efforts in the Security Council. And I say efforts because to the extent that we're not succeeding, it would feel terrible if it came from an utter lack of trying. I have been in foreign service now for 13 years, and I would say that this whole undertaking of having a seat on the Security Council has provided us as a service with an unprecedented opportunity to focus and to prioritize, which in all honesty, we're not always good at, because in this line of work, we deal with literally everything you can find on an international agenda. And when everything is important, it is hard to prioritize anything, right? But in terms of the Security Council, in diplomatic terms, we have had a laser focus. And in my experience, when we are targeted in that way, we are also effective. So in that sense, the Security Council has given us an opportunity of efforts and an opportunity of focus. Then, secondly, as you know, no country can escape geopolitics, and even less so in the Security Council. If the geopolitical situation is unfavorable in terms of compromise and progress, well, then that is how the game is set, and that is what you have to play with. And anyone who has followed the Security Council over some time know that even when the geopolitical situation is favorable, progress in the Security Council remains slow. That is the very nature of compromise in a complicated world. Among the permanent 5 and the elected 10, it is an inch-by-inch game by definition. And I guess that's just sort of being human, right? As a reference, the Norwegian National Mediation Service in Norway settled disputes among neighbors living in Norway. And one of the most common problems they deal with are actually trees. Trees with branches hanging over the garden next door. People spend years fighting over trees. So in that sense, it's not that hard to grasp that countries spend decades trying to agree on how to proceed with the most complicated questions on a national scale. So it is a little bit about expectations as well. Ending conflict is indeed a most challenging field of international politics. And currently, as Tore mentioned, it does not help that the geopolitical situation is quite challenging. It favors compromise even less than normal. But making an effort still pays off. And having a serious ground game behind the scenes pays off. So that on women, peace and security, we are still managing to make some progress as well as to defend achievements made over the past 2 decades. I would say that the efforts behind the scenes are the most important. That is where diplomacy happens, not visible to the public, but of crucial importance, as this is where we can negotiate language that some other council members have difficulties with. We have, by choice and by virtue of pursuing effects on the ground as our priority, not been looking to score new resolutions of women, peace and security in the Council. Because we see the implementation gap as the most acute problem to progress on this agenda. Therefore, our main task has been to find ways to strengthen commitments to implement already agreed language. Therefore, we've had a particular effort on mandates for UN missions. Sorry. But we've also tried to focus on a certain key part of the women, peace and security agenda, and that is participation. A word I have said so many times over the last year that it's starting to sound weird to me. Participation, participation. I would hope that if anything, the importance of women's participation is a legacy that we leave behind when we leave our elected seat at the end of this year. Because nothing can replace participation. We will of course talk about protection, we can talk about gender sensitivity, we can talk about education, research, disarmament, security, and whatnot. They're all important, but without participation of women in all of the above, and in peace processes, and in shaping society, security, and peace, there is no other path to success. Women working hard for change around the world do not want and do not deserve for our ambition to stop at their right to not be a victim. They and the world deserve that our ambition is for them to be actors, actors of change and actors of policy. It takes us back to the very basic of the gender perspective and the lesson that the easiest way to include a gender perspective is to have both men and women present to meaningfully influence decisions. Now, personally, I don't think it's just the easiest way. I think it's the only way. And our consistent focus on participation on the Council does not mean that we don't think issues as protection are important, but you can't protect yourself to power. You can't protect yourself to influence. Those who protect you also wield power over you, but you can actually participate yourself to power, and you can participate your way to influence. So I hope and believe that in terms of achievements on Women, Peace and Security Council, we will leave a legacy of participation. And we do this across the board, not only in language. We have a woman ambassador in New York. We have a woman political coordinator in New York, which truly is a point job for all that goes on between the member states of the council. And when we meet the Taliban in Kabul, we have women in our delegation, even young women. That is walking the talk, and what we also miss from so many other countries. Because diplomacy is often too much talk and too little action. And I have had my decent share of all male delegations from other countries talking about how important women inclusion in politics is. Then I would like to talk briefly about our presidency this past month and our signature event, Protecting Participation, which I would say was kind of a big deal. Because this is an issue that have not previously been on the formal agenda of the Security Council. And a big deal because it's not that easy to address the issue of human rights defenders and peace advocates in the Security Council. And I think that protecting participation neatly encapsulates the core of the Women Peace agenda and the relationship between protection and participation. We protect participation to enable participation, and participation enables real and long-term systemic participation and protection. Protection measures without women's participation is, to me, a never-ending story, where we end up with societies that literally feed new women into a state of being where they come dependent on ad hoc protection measures. And when the international community, regional bodies, and civil society tries to shape some sort of protection measure that can alleviate the pain, all the while knowing that without women themselves participating in shaping those protection measures at a local and domestic level, we just keep going in circle. So by taking this issue of protecting women peace builders and human rights defenders to the Security Council, we have at least forced all the members of the Council to deal with the issue and show their cards. Where do they stand? And in our experience, it seems to be the case that it's a rough spot communication-wise today to be against women. Therefore, you need to have a little experience on this issue to know the many subtle ways some countries show their opposition to this agenda. Sometimes also not so subtle. By having had this issue on the formal agenda, we have moved the bar a little and made it easier to deal with it again, a stepping stone for future progress. But even more important, I would say, are the ways in which we have cooperated with civil society. More than 50 civil society experts convened in January on the issue of reprisals. Their recommendations will be guiding our work on this going ahead. And we have had civil society representatives briefing across the board during our presidency, an integral part of what we wanted to achieve. Of course, in close cooperation with other member states, so that also other member states do the same, which has been the case. Parallel to this, we had the launch of the Women Human Rights Defender window facilitated by the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which is our way of making sure that we keep having a consistent approach to this issue from the Security Council to the ground in conflict areas. So in a sense, we used our signature event to make noise about an issue that is important to us and garner support for a mechanism that will help women that are victims of reprisals. And from what we have heard, it has been very effective. Many other countries have joined and others are considering joining the fund still. Lastly, I want to talk a little about Afghanistan and women, peace and security. Now, understandably, women's situation in Afghanistan has manifested itself as a test case on how serious the international community is on women's role in society. We have all, at least from a Western perspective, been talking loudly for years about full, equal and meaningful participation of women, and of girls' education and women's economic and political participation. Now, are we going to walk that talk? That is the question. And if we are, what does that mean? What does that look like? Because ultimately, we do not decide now, right? Taliban does. By taking over, they also took over the responsibility for the future of Afghanistan. They can't hide behind the international community or anyone else and say that it is all our fault, which they probably will do anyways. But at the same time, we've been heavily invested in Afghanistan for over 20 years, and we will continue to be invested. and facilitating this meeting in Oslo is a way for us to be invested. Because remember, the Taliban meets with other countries as well. Many do not care much for the role of women in society at all. So we need to be there with the things that we care about. And the meetings in Oslo with the Taliban obviously did not come about in the best way possible, because normally we would like to have a closer dialogue with civil society on their participation as well and on how to proceed. But due to secrecy, this was not possible this time. But it's a compromise that we normally don't want to take, but which we felt forced to on this one. I think I'm going to stop there to round off so that others can get the floor as well. But I want to assure that any meeting between the Norwegian government and the Taliban does not happen without women's rights and their situation being parts of those talks. That's absolutely certain. And having a civil society component was crucial to us. And this was not the start of never-ending political talks. Afghanistan is in a dire economic and humanitarian situation, and that is an issue that we needed to engage with them on sooner rather than later. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you to everyone for listening in.
Thank you so much, André, for that introduction. And of course, it will be possible for you to share more perspectives and views with us later on when we are going to have more of a conversation between the panelists. There were a number of issues there that I'm sure that many would like to respond to and maybe ask further questions on, not least Afghanistan, which I guess Sanam she has a number of burning questions and thoughts about that, I'm sure. But first we will move to Louise Olsen, because André, you were talking about Norway focusing more on the actual implementation now of the commitments made by the Security Council in a number of resolutions rather than having another resolution adopted. And this is actually a nice segue into Louise, because she has been involved and she has a number of projects ongoing currently where she's specifically focusing on issues such as these. How can we go about to integrate language on women, peace and security in Security Council resolutions? What is the status of that sort of integration? And she has also been doing actually fresh off the press research looking into the number of briefers, civil society briefers, for instance, to the Security Council. So I'm sure that Louise, she will address some of this in her presentation. As I said, Louise is a senior researcher here at PRIA. She has been researching issues relating to the UN and the Women, Peace and Security agenda since, I guess, mid-1990s. So she is a really experienced expert on topics such as these. Yeah, I think I'll just give you the floor, Louise. You, as far as I understand, you have a PowerPoint presentation that you would like to share with us?
Yes, exactly. And Nora has been very kind to help me out. Thank you, Nora. So thank you, Toren, for that kind introduction, and thank you, André, for a very interesting presentation. I think it sort of dovetails very nicely into the comments that I prepared before I heard your presentation, because I think what I will reflect on is also a direct relation to the question for this event. So to what extent has Norway meaningfully strengthened the WPS agenda through its membership in the Council? And I think you also really well described how, particularly from a researcher's perspective, we cannot really sort of tease out and sort of assess the specific contributions of one country, because of course there's a number of negotiation processes. It's a very complex context. So why did I then choose a question that I can't answer as the focus of my reflections? Well, I think it's because this question does raise some key points about what we actually mean when we say that an elected member should meaningfully strengthen WPS. And here I will focus specifically on sort of general Security Council negotiations. And I think as the first row illustrates, I think we have tended, as Toren said, to think about this as sort of formulating or negotiating new resolutions. But I think that Sanam will also testify that by now we have a framework. It was quite risky to open up new negotiations. So moving forward on actually implementing and realizing and living, walking the talk might be a sort of a better focus at present. And this then involve or raise a number of other important objectives on strengthening WPS, as we can see in this table. So a state can, for example, increase visibility, understanding and support of sort of identified but underdeveloped WPS issues. A state can seek to contribute by making the process under which the council take decisions better at sort of consistently considering WPS in a more concrete way by sort of contributing to amending working methods, both formal and informal. And a state can promote the integration of WPS in specific core outcomes, such as resolutions that can have more of a direct impact in the lives of women in conflict contexts, such as the example from Afghanistan brings out. So I'll give you a few short examples about how Norway relate to these three objectives. And I also then interject some suggestions from our research that I hope can be also relevant for the way forward in 2022. Next slide, please. Okay, so on the objective then of improving the understanding and support for specific WPS issues, I would argue that the open debate on protecting participation provides a really good example of what this can mean in practice. Since this elevated the question of protecting women in political processes towards peace and security to the ministerial level, sort of put it up higher on the prioritized agenda, and also then sought to improve the understanding of what this kind of violence, intimidation and repressions look like and what the concrete consequences for participation can be. And research really supports that this is improved understanding is really central here. So in a new PRIO policy brief, Rudabek Kishi and I use ACLED data on political violence targeting women in politics to bring up some examples from the council countries that are on the council's agenda. And what this really suggests is that there is a need for this nuanced understanding. And in addition to women human rights defenders and social leaders, it's also how do we understand women's sort of participation in voting as government officials, as politicians, sort of providing a nuanced understanding of what it means for women to be part of these political processes. And also then that the data also show the need then to really adapt the protective measures to the specific context and the specific group, so that all of these require different approaches. And secondly, as this figure sort of illustrates, a core challenge that's often brought up by civil society is, of course, that violence, political violence targeting women in politics exists in all regions of the world. So it's not just the countries on the agenda, there's actually existing in member states that are sort of part of the council. And what does that mean then for the challenges of addressing this, as it can strike quite close to home? Next slide, please. An example of an objective in terms of contributing to amending the working methods. There's been a longer debate on how do you sort of improve then the access to information on WPS for the council members in order to actually improve the decisions. And then it also then becomes really critical in terms of who can then brief the council. And Norway here, of course, formulates an objective that it consistently is striving for a more gender balanced participation. And we would argue that that then includes briefers to the council. So in a new policy brief, Anna-Maria Obermeier and I look at the developments in the 2015 to 21 period. And what we can see in this figure is that among the invited briefers that are from organizations that are external to the UN, then women are quite well represented among civil society and from government institutions, whereas men completely almost dominate when the briefers come from other multinational organizations. And importantly, if we to this group of briefers add UN briefers, which is the largest category, the data between 2015 and 21 shows that 70% of all briefers have actually been male. However, change is also possible. So in 2021, the council actually reached close to a 50-50 balance among its briefers. And during Norway's presidency, we could see that if we measure until the 26th of January, there were 29 briefers, 15 women and 14 men, and actually a fairly good representation also from the UN system. Next slide, please. So what we also know, of course, that if you want to look at how to promote WPS, just having women present does, of course, not naturally result in an improvement in women's rights or women's concerns being integrated. So, and because women are, of course, not a consistent group. But if we instead look closer at women's civil society organizations, where Norway also says that it's important that their voices are recognized by the Council, our data also shows that there has been a positive change. So in 2015, women's civil society were quite few and they were primarily invited to WPS events. By 2021, the number had grown to about 15 per year, where they also were invited to a larger number of conflict-specific, country-specific meetings to provide more sort of detailed input there. And during Norway's presidency, I think there were 3 to 4 CSOs invited. Naturally, it doesn't mean that because you are consulted that your voice are then included in the decision. So I think a question for us all is how do we then trace and understand what kind of impact these briefings have? Move to the last slide. It is, of course, a question in terms of how do we then integrate WPS in regular work? How does it become core work? So Patty Chang, Anna-Maria Obermein are tracking language, as Toren said, into regular council resolutions. So what happened in 2021? Well, about 60% of all resolutions contain WPS references by now. Of those that contain references, as this figure shows, they do have a fairly good balance in terms of rights protection and participation, where participation actually overtook protection as the largest theme by the end of 2021. But Patty will tell me that that depends on how you cut the data. So, but at least there's a fair balance. And as a way forward, we also suggest that now there's also a need to look at how actionable and prioritized are the language. And here there's fair amount of improvements needed. So references tend to have a fairly low priority, and also the language tend to be quite generic. Protection language is a little bit better and a bit more concrete, whereas participation language remain quite general. However, as André say, and this is really the concluding point, there is increasing resistance to including WPS references and also to moving forward on WPS. However, that if it's so that if we assess a state's contributions by its successes and its visibility on WPS, even though perhaps the need for moving forward is in the areas where the chances are most slim and most difficult, is there a risk that we are in a sense pushing states towards the, what I think in the UN context is called like vanity projects that are really look really nice and get a lot of visibility, but doesn't really make us sort of implement and change the situation for women on the ground? And then how can we make and really understand what strengthening meaningful, the WPS meaningfully in the council really means? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thank you for providing these really interesting data and statistics on the figures, because it's really important for us to have this kind of data to have a baseline and to then track developments and trends over time, so we know what we are actually talking about. We will come back to this. Now I would like just to move on and give the floor to Sanam. I guess you are burning with a lot of thoughts and reflections now based on what you've heard. But for those of you who do not know Sanam, let me just say a few words. In the very beginning of my introduction, I referred to you as the director of the Center for Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics. But I think in this context, it's probably just as important that you are the founder and executive director of the International Civil Society Action Network, also known as ICAN. And ICAN is an organization that promotes inclusive and sustainable peace in countries affected by violent conflict, extremism, militarism, and closing political space. And ICAN is particularly concerned with the importance of recognizing the critical role of women peace builders. Sanam has been an advocate for the Women, Peace and Security agenda also since before this became an agenda in the 1990s. And you were actually also involved in the drafting of the text of the Mother Resolution, Resolution 1325. So you have been in this game for a long time. And I invited you to this panel because I wanted you to provide the civil society perspective on where we are now in terms of, working on the Women, Peace and Security agenda within the Security Council, and also your reflections on Norway's role, because I know that you have been following Norway for many, many years, and also are among the civil society organizations that have benefited from both the political support but also financial support from Norway. So I think I just stop there and leave the floor to you for about 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to try and be quick and just make some bullet point remarks. Thank you very much for having me. And I just want to start by saying that back in 2014, I did a meeting on how to do better inclusion and look at the different processes from Colombia to Myanmar to Syria at the time. And we had the Norwegian ambassador to Washington attend the meeting. So there's a room full of 60 people, multiple countries. I asked everybody I said, anybody who's getting Norwegian support for their peace work, put your hand up. The entire room put their hand up. So this is to say that, number one, Norway is a small, very wealthy country that doesn't really need to be in this space if they didn't want to be. They've chosen to be. We all know what the reasons are, and it's good for the sort of, as you say, in terms of presence on the international stage. But you've taken on something really difficult, right? Peace diplomacy is not easy. And peace diplomacy in the context that we're talking about and the nature of the conflicts that we're talking about since the end of the Cold War are particularly difficult. What I've seen overall in terms of Norway, and then I'll come to the Security Council piece, is that Norway has been really good and has a lot of experience in dealing with armed groups, the folks that nobody else wants to talk to. As André mentioned, you've been talking to the Taliban for many, many, many years, right? At the same time, Norway has been really effective in engaging the women peace builders, organizations like mine, others, providing the support and so forth. What I see, and I'm going to be straight up very frank because I have only 5 minutes, is that we haven't, what's missing is the integration when it comes to the peace diplomacy, right? It's still siloed. And what I would like to see in terms of Norway's own processes, whether it's through the council or otherwise, is to actually blend these things together. And this is why the Oslo meeting that just happened is important. And it's actually a really critical litmus test, right? As André said, there was, for various reasons, it was impossible to tell civil society or women's organizations that this was going on. On the other hand, when it happened, it was, the news came out, and to be honest, the Taliban get public diplomacy, right? They put out pictures of them on their planes landing in Oslo, and that became the dominant conversation. What would have been interesting is that if we'd had a conversation in the background, as André said, to say, how do you do this? Maybe some pictures of the women civil society actors with senior figures in the Norwegian government would have changed the narrative in the public space, right? So public and private right now are really, really critical. And I think that going forward, the question of how we do more integration, how you do more trusted back behind the scenes work with civil society is really where it should be. And I know that it's really difficult, right? Nobody is getting this right. And if there's one country that I would trust to do it well, is Norway, because of the history and because of the way it's also perceived internationally. So I think that there's a huge potential, and the effort really deserves tremendous credit, because what also people forget is that in the Oslo meeting, the EU was there, the Germans were there, the British were there, the Americans were there. They didn't get the same flack that Norway did. So that there is that question of who is fronting these issues, but that it's very important to understand we need to take these things forward. Secondly, coming to the council, it was really interesting to listen to Louise, and it reminded me of how important these little processes are at that high level, and then when you take it to the ground, words and ideas matter, right? So when I look at my history and I think, okay, how far were we able to get language into 1325, language into 1820 on sexual violence? I couldn't get the words men and boys into the text of Resolution 1820 because Libya said that men and boys don't get raped. So we had to use the word civilians or people, right? 2019, I was just looking at my text. We were trying to get reference to protection of women peace builders, women peace builders as a term, and women's human rights defenders. I can tell you there was a country on board that wanted to say all these activities can happen according to national law, right? Imagine that text had gone in. So the way these language, that the resolutions are negotiated, and those of us who are behind the scenes put in words here and words there and try and move the agenda, is incredibly complicated. And I truly value the relationships that we have with the governments that go in and try and push the agenda forward. That said, the language matters, the briefers matter. It's really important that you don't just have women peace, at the Women, Peace and Security event, 1,500 people, women speaking, and then when it comes to Yemen, nobody, right? We need the country specific agendas to have the same briefers. And I'll end with, I just want to end with sort of a few thoughts on this question of where Norway is and where we need to take things forward. Number one, it is important to lead by example. That's what Norway is doing. When you do it, when someone does it, others follow, right? So that own it, be proud of it, go forward, we're with you. I think that's important. Number two, we need to practice what we preach, right? And this I think on Afghanistan is where there needs to be a huge amount of self-reflection across the entire WPS community in all the countries. We've been, we've been sitting in the middle of all this. We have 2,000 people who have come to us asking for evacuation. And so it's one thing talking about protection and having nice resolutions. It's a whole other thing when people's lives are at risk, right? And that's so the leading by example, I think, becomes important. And there is a question when we talk about protection and participation, there has to be a realization that participation can also lead to insecurity. We have a colleague right now who is in hospital, unconscious, having been in jail because of his peace activism in his country. And also because we invited him with Germany to participate in an informal meeting with the Security Council. That's one of the points that is on his caseload for why he was arrested, right? One of the points, but it was an excuse. We need to do something about that. Women in Afghanistan right now, in the immediate aftermath of Oslo, women protesters are being arrested daily. The Taliban is testing the will and the stance of the international community. If we don't speak out, they will get away with it. And if they get away with it, every other extremist movement around the world is going to get away with it. So what happens in Afghanistan doesn't stay in Afghanistan. It has implications elsewhere, right? And finally, so the protection and participation need to have action and conditionality related. And then I want to come to this integration question, and I'll make a few points. Number one, we need the peace processes to be integrated. And one thing that I would like to see is that the Afghan process, if we had Afghan women peace builders in Oslo, in Doha a year ago, I don't think Afghanistan would be where it is right now. Right? It's good that it started now, but it needs to continue. That said, on Yemen, on Mali, and all these other places, it's time to put this inclusive process in now in a systematic way. So integrate the peace builders into the existing processes through the UN or bilaterally. Second, on the humanitarian issues, we cannot say, oh, in Afghanistan, there's women's rights, or here women are talking about participation, but over here we're talking humanitarian, and these two things are disconnected. Women are integral to the delivery of humanitarian aid. Women are integral to as recipients of humanitarian aid. We have a lot of information about that, so that needs to be part and parcel, and the demands on humanitarian organizations need to be thought through. Third, refugees and resettlement. Right now, what's happening is that ministries of foreign affairs around the world are great on the question of Afghan women and how we deal with women's human rights defenders and what support they need. It's the Home Office, it's the immigration folks that are blocking a lot of the evacuation, right? We can't say we believe in protection of peace builders on one hand and then actually not deliver on the other hand. And this is across the board. It's not just one country. We're seeing it in all the different spaces. And finally, on this WPS agenda, and I'm just going to throw this out there, we need systematic and consistent focus on this question of participation, as André said, at the UN and internationally in our multilateral spaces. We don't have that at the UN. We need a WPS envoy, an SRSG at that level, because The Office on Sexual Violence has a lot to do. UN Women has a ton of work to do on generic other issues, right? This question of participation in peace processes, in these political processes, needs systematic attention. It needs detailed attention. It needs to be connected from the highest levels to the grassroots. And if you don't have an entity that deals with it, it gets lost. So this, to me, I think is the next step of where we need to go. But I'll end with this. A thought exercise. If Norway wasn't leading on this and hadn't opened the space for others to come in, I'm not sure where this agenda would be. So for all the flaws and all the frustrations that we all have, I'm still incredibly grateful for the engagement that we can have with Norway, and actually the very frank conversations that we can even have right now, regardless of whatever the financial relationships are with my organization or others in this space. I think we tend to have a very honest conversation with each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanam. I'm sure that André would like to pick up on a few things here, not least on Afghanistan. But I'll soon open up for that. But first, I would like to introduce the last, but definitely not the least important speaker on this panel here today. And that's Niels Nagelhus Schia. He's a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. And his research revolves around issues of international organizations, global governance, peace building, state building. And in recent years, he has worked a lot on cybersecurity, but he's not going to talk about cybersecurity here today. He is trained as an anthropologist, and he did his PhD, an ethnographic study or account of the UN Security Council and dynamics and power politics at the UN Security Council. And he has been following closely the Norwegian membership and also Norwegian foreign policy in relation to the UN and also women, peace and security for many, many years. And most recently, he also co-authored with a NUPI colleague, Kristin Haugvik, a report entitled Small States, Different Approaches, Estonia and Norway on the UN Security Council. So we are really eager to have your take on this whole issue of Norway on the Security Council. To what extent can small states make a difference? Not only on advancing agendas like women, peace and security, but advancing normative agendas more generally. So please, Niels, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Torunn, for that very nice introduction. And thank you also to the previous speakers for very, very interesting talks. Since you have already heard so much and so many very interesting points about what Norway has achieved on the women, peace and security agenda during the first year, I want to focus specifically on that agenda. I will talk more, like Torunn said, about the elected member states and their role in the council, what they can do, and also what we could understand as a success. But first, I think it's important to mention that just to have this background or context, it's important to mention that the Permanent Five, the veto powers, they don't decide everything. And that the most existential disagreements and crises are not being debated that often, and that there are many tasks that are more ongoing routine tasks in the council, for instance, peacekeeping, political missions, and sanctions committees. Okay, so what can the elected member states hope to achieve when they're in the council for 2 years? Or perhaps even more specifically, I would highlight two things with this aspect. The first one is pathways to impact for elected member states, and the second one is a variation in success measures for elected member states. So the way I see it, there are 4 key paths to influence, at least those 4 key paths that I want to highlight. And The first one and most obvious one, and also most immediate one, since we're talking about Norway, is the presidency, where elected member states can impact the agenda and make use of opportunities that come with this role. So during Norway's presidency, actually, there was only 2 resolutions that were adopted. One of them was a technical renewal, and in addition, there was no presidential statement. But does this mean that the presidency was a failure? No, I don't think so. You could mention that the context was a bit challenging because it was January. This is a bit different from the other months because you're phasing out old member states and phasing in new ones. And then additionally, the Omicron hit New York very hard this month and put some limitations, not very many, but a few limitations on the activities. But Norway also held 3 signature meetings. One of them was the meeting on that has already been mentioned on women, peace and security. Another one was on protection of civilians in urban conflicts, and the third one was on peace diplomacy. Additionally, Norway helped prepare the ground for future cases or future resolutions. The UNAMA mandate is going to be renewed in March. There was also some work being done on piracy and also support for the democratic transition in Myanmar, and a lot of other issues that was being discussed on the agenda. So a second pathway is to take initiatives to meetings and special events to raise an issue and draw the attention of the council to specific topics. This can be done both within and outside of the presidency. So the signature meeting was an example on this, and Estonia, for instance, they did a lot of such meetings on cybersecurity and really put a lot of efforts trying to put this topic on the agenda of the Security Council. A third path to impact is coalition building. So the consensus focus in the Council makes it very important to build coalitions and support for your initiatives. And it's very hard to run an issue independently in the Council. And the fourth pathway is the role of the pen holder. But I could also mention the leading of committees, leading of sanction groups and expert groups. And the fifth pathway is to work in a more indirect way to push a topic, for instance, in more specific land situations that are being discussed in the Council. So those were the 5 pathways to impact. And now I'll turn to the various ways of measuring success. Because there is a tendency to look at the elected member states as one homogeneous category, but they do have different approaches to the Council and also quite different measures of success. So the way I see it, it is 3 key ways of measuring success for an elected member state in the Council. The first one is the platforming of a topic or creating narratives of a situation. For instance, Estonia's work on cybersecurity in the Council and Norway's work on peace diplomacy. The goal here is to raise attention to an issue or frame an issue, not necessarily adopt a resolution or a presidential statement. The second one is through adopting resolutions or presidential statements, mandates, and press releases. This makes it more necessary to build coalitions and support to reach consensus. Resolutions are more concrete results than those in the first category, but they are harder to achieve and take longer time to reach. A third success measure is improvements of the Council, or making new and innovative practices and processes, such as, for instance, the penholder function, which is not really new anymore. And we could also mention the Finnish initiative on phasing in new member states. And we could also mention the peace diplomacy retreat that Norway arranged in January, which is kind of a new model in the Security Council context. And I would also like to mention that the since we're talking about Norway and the first year of the council here, I would also like to mention that Norway has done a lot to strengthen a knowledge and research-based foreign politics in the Security Council. So they've done a couple of things there that are interesting. And some of these success measures work better domestically than others, but I think they're all being used by elected member states when highlighting success. And there are probably others as well, but I don't. There were only these three that I had time to include here. So I would just like to stop there and say thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Niels. Now, as all four of you have been introduced and have had your, what should I say, introductory remarks, I would like to open up for a few minutes for a conversation between those on the panel. But I would just like to remind everyone watching or listening in that you can ask questions in the chat, because I realize that we have a number of attendees joining a few minutes into the webinar, so maybe you didn't hear what I said about asking questions in the chat. So please, I encourage you to ask questions to either of the panelists or to the panel as such. I don't know, does anyone want to start out feeling an urge, a need to respond to what you heard any one of the others say? Maybe I should put you on the spot, André. At least I think it would be quite interesting, to the extent you can talk much about it, Sanam's critique of, the missed opportunity of not including civil society more thoroughly in the planning of the meeting with the Taliban, and not least in terms of, she was talking about the narrative that Taliban in a way won the competition for media attention, for instance. So, André, if you would like to start out.
Yeah, thank you. I'll absolutely comment on that as well. And no, there is so much. Interesting food for thought that my brain is almost melting. But I wanted to pick up on what Sanam said about participation being dangerous, right? And I think that's something that we absolutely have to stress. It is. That's the sad fact of the world we live in, that women who participate, they are exposed to threats and to violence, and that's not an issue isolated to conflict situations. That's in general across the board in too many countries, because I'm not saying that men changemakers or male changemakers have an easy time, but the thing about women is the visibility and the fact that you are working against culture, history, rules, regulations, a whole package of not just glass ceilings, but real concrete. So it's really, really tough. And that's why we use this phrase normalize participation in our event, because I think to get past all of that, we need to normalize women's participation so that, it's not a thing. It's not something special. It's a woman talking about politics. That's not a wow. That's a what is she saying? That's what you want to hear, not who she is, which is often the case in too many countries. So, and it's a tiresome process, but that's where we want to end, normalize women's participation. And, in terms of, I think it relates to several of the comments in terms of integration in peace processes and the evacuation from Afghanistan and many other things. I mean, the international system it's a little bit weird when you say a system, right? Because a system sort of is a word for something that functions in a way, functions neatly. But the international system is a work in progress or in process. It's, and part of that system was made to not have change happen. It was made so that we could stop change from happening, which is interesting, right? And now we're using the same system to facilitate change. And in my opinion, as a change maker, I mean, we're not even close to where we would want to be in terms of the potential for effect and cooperation that system can have, right? But it's still very much marked by competition. It's still very much marked by states. And on Afghanistan, as Sanam mentioned, when this happens, right, we of course cooperate, particularly with in the frame of NATO and like-minded and such, but not even close to the extent that we could, right? And ICANN was doing an amazing job in trying to make some system out of all of these names that came out of Afghanistan and being circulated, and it's and we don't have time, and it's difficult. So there is a lot of potential. And this leads me to the next, which is basically political will, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what we lack. And everything we do is to try to impact political will or try to make stuff happen when it lacks. And that second part, I'm not even sure the extent to which that is really possible on a sort of a strategic sense, but that's what we try to do, and we can't impact the political level. We try to impact a more communal level, right, so that we can facilitate for change in the future. But it's really, really tricky, and we still haven't cracked that code on how to progress when we lack political will, because it's not about the lack of us pressing on, but at the end of the day, when we meet a government from country X, it's only so much we can do, right? And we try and we work sideways with other countries, because of course the more we can have on board on the women, peace and security issue and on that participation, the stronger we are. So that is my wish for this field going ahead. And I think the report that came out last year, the index on women, peace and security, shows some good signs. The good sign is that the countries that are doing well are doing increasingly better. The sad sign is that the countries that are doing worse are doing increasingly worse. But on the good end of the scale, it means that more countries are more likely to take this issue into that space where the hardcore security questions are answered, right? And that's what you point to several times. We can't talk about women, peace and security only in a women, peace and security frame. We must talk about it on Syria, on Yemen, on Mali, on Myanmar, on those country-specific situations. That's where we need to be. Thank you.
Thank you, André. I was wondering, Louise, because both Sanam and André mentioned the worrying trend now or development with violence against women, peace builders in general, but also we see an increase in violence against those women who actually come and brief the Security Council. And I think all of us know examples of this. In your research, the data you have, can you also have you started to document this, and can you see the same trends in your material?
Unfortunately, that's not possible with this data that we have. But I think, Toren, you put, and also Sanam and André, I think this sort of, what do we mean by normalizing participation? What kind of knowledge do we then, I think, need to take from research, which is now quite substantial of sort of improving our understanding of women's agency. If we actually take women's agency as seriously as we say, I mean, we repeat that sentence over and over, women are agents, okay. But that means that they are agents within a specific political context. And how do we then improve our way of talking about that and understanding that in a way that, like Sanam said, it actually becomes integrated into our resolution of a specific conflict and our understanding of a specific conflict? Because I still have a feeling that we still tend to have like this separate track for women's agency, women's participation. It's sort of over there somewhere. And I think one of the key points here is probably in our own narrative and our own way of thinking about this. So we tend to often talk about, even in the terms of violence against women. Okay, just almost like violence just sort of appears out of nowhere, out of this like social context. No. Women are political agents, therefore they are targeted by specific groups in specific condition for specific reason. And we need to understand violence against women in that context, and we need to place the gender analysis within the conflict analysis in order to actually understand how that plays out. And that's the only way we can also, together with these women, develop protection measures and think around protecting women. I think that could be effective. The other one is, I think...
Can I just, since you don't say it, I want to be very rude and say normally violence done by men, I would just say.
Yeah, definitely. But also sort of with a very specific purpose of achieving a specific goal, so that we can actually get at that goal. Why do they do this? What are the specific? And I think also here, based on Elin Bjarnegård's the work on terms of, so when is this violence gendered and when is it targeted sort of at both women and men because they're trying to change the political situation, that we get a better grip at that. And I think in that it's also important that Marav and I have an article where we look at different kind of war terminations and the different effects that different kind of war endings have on women's political rights over time. And this really shows that under some circumstances, the actors are actually both interested and also willing to work on women's rights, sometimes for really selfish reasons, because they need to build up the legitimacy base, their support base, etc. They want to contribute to some kind of change that also provides them with insights, but also because it's been part of their ideology. So when we then integrate the gender analysis, what are then the options and the positive engagement that we can have with different parties in different social contexts that are also pro-gender equality? How do we integrate WPS in the larger debate without losing, of course, the transformative part of this agenda? Thanks.
Thanks, Louise. Sanam, you asked for the floor. You are muted.
I want to get back to some of the basic kind of first principles of what we're talking about here. Even in this conversation, the assumption is that you have the parties to the conflict and then there are women around it, right? In the last 25 years that I've been in this field, one of the reasons why we've worked on the WPS agenda and said participation of peace builders and so forth is that essence of the elite and the parties, two-party process that, you have the government and you have armed groups, etc. And they are the people that matter to end the conflict and bring peace. We question that entire premise. Elite bargains don't work, right? We need them there. We need the armed groups. We need the terrorist groups. We need the governments. We need them there to end their fighting. So they are necessary, but they're not sufficient. Because when you look at a situation like Yemen, for example, right? What's happening? Government with Saudi support and the US support and others is bombing civilians. The Houthis are attacking civilians. Who is looking after civilians, right? Who's run to look after the civilians? Actually, it's peace builders, and actually overwhelmingly it is women because they still have mobility. So if we as Norway or we as a Security Council or whoever it is, if we are interested in the business of peace, we should be identifying the peace actors and recognizing that they are actors in that space on peace, right? And on the war, for that matter. And until and unless we shift our thinking in that way, we're still going to be in this business of sidelining and sideshowing women and thinking the main guys are here and then we have to tuck the women in everywhere. That framing has to change. And that's, for me, that's been the essence of why I've been doing this work, that it's bringing those voices in. That's one thing. Secondly, the messenger matters, right? So why have we spent years saying bring Afghan women peace builders to the table with the Taliban? Because having a Mahbouba Siraj, as you had, who is, has years of experience living as an Afghan, living there, knows their language, knows their culture, knows their religion, she conveys as the messenger, the way she conveys the communicates is different to the way a Swedish person can, or a Norwegian person can, or whatever, right? So, and in my, I mean, part of the reason why I do this is I say, I advocate and then I practice what I'm trying to preach, right? To see does it work. I can tell you that for me personally, when I've been out there and they've seen my Allah and they know that I'm Muslim background, mother, middle-aged, you name, your identity as a person in the diplomatic mediation space matters in terms of how people engage with you. You have a different conversation. So it's changing business as usual. And this is what we need to grasp and put into the spaces. And I go back to what André was saying. We know there are lots of states right now that don't want that. But the challenge to them is, what the hell do they want? Because the world is getting more and more unpeaceful, right? So if they don't like what we're saying, what's their solution? And the idea that the solution is authoritarianism and we're just going to bash everybody's head and chuck them in jail does not work. So we need to go out there and think about and have these conversations, I think, in a more systematic way. Thank you.
Since we are now talking about Afghanistan, I see that there is a question in the chat from Kari Thorsen on Afghanistan and the talks with Taliban. Has been mentioned several times by different panelists. There are many thoughts about the need to recognize Afghans in the diaspora as part of the Afghan civil society. No, it's a question. Are there any thoughts about the need to recognize Afghans in the diaspora as part of Afghan civil society? Is anything being done to include Afghans in the diaspora in talks to influence the way forward, and how could this be done? Yeah, I don't know who would like to start. Maybe, should I put you on the spot again, André?
I like being put on the spot.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's, we facilitate, right? I mean, that's, I think that's the key to how we approach this. We don't want to put ourselves in the middle of that room and point in any direction, because ownership is key. And I know that there is a discussion among Afghans about those who left and those who stayed. And I don't think it's in, it's not on me to have opinions about that, because they need to sort of own a version that for them is presentable and that for them gives a result that they can all stand by. But, I will say though, and it's probably also a bit of a minefield to go into, but as I do engage a lot with civil society, I would encourage, because they encourage us, right, to do different things, and I will also allow myself to encourage civil society to do something, and that is to focus on what you agree on. Focus on, particularly on the agenda of women's participation and women, peace and security. Civil society will be much stronger versus governments and other actors if they can have a joint message and, 1, 2, 3 things that we are aligned on. Because I know that governments that are not aligned with the agenda of the civil society, they will exploit any fracture they see in that civil society. But to answer to the question, we facilitate, and ownership should be with, if we talk about Afghanistan, it should be with the Afghans. Thank you.
Is there anything you would like to add, Sanam, since you are working a lot with Afghan women from different corners of Afghan civil society?
Yeah, maybe 3 quick points. One, I think for a community of people who have just lost everything, and lost their homes and are in transition. And, I look back to my parents and what happened in the Iranian Revolution, and I look at how the Afghans in the last 6 months that have come into the diaspora have set, wherever they are, they've planted and they're already active. I think they're doing an unbelievable job. Number one, they are highly connected. They are having the dialogues inside and outside and so forth. So I think that what we need to do is enable and support and facilitate and be there and accompany them as much as possible as international actors, and share the experiences of other countries. This diaspora question is not new to Afghanistan. So in ICANN, one of the things that we're doing is we're facilitating conversations between our Afghan colleagues and our Yemeni and Syrian colleagues, bringing the experiences from the Iranian diaspora and others to say what happens, and how do you get united, how do forces divide you. So that support and facilitation, I think, is absolutely critical going forward. That said, I also think that one of the reasons why we say that we need to be more integrated with our bilateral and multilateral partners is that if we know what's happening, if we have some inkling of how to support things, we can facilitate the kinds of discussions that André's saying. So part of the really valuable stuff that goes on behind the scenes is to say, what are you hearing? What's the messaging that we need? From my side, saying, it's great that you talk about women's rights, but here are 3 specific asks that we have that should be there, right? The women who came should not be attacked. The women protesters should be released, right? If women are being raped, it should be stopped, and the Taliban should be investigating it. This is not Islam, right? That behind the scenes conversation of what André says they need from civil society is really helpful in terms of guiding the conversations. Otherwise, there's a million issues to talk about, right? And a million issues becomes 0 issues. So that trusted, integrated relationship going forward is I think relevant. As I say, it's not just about Afghanistan. We have the same problems with Yemen and Syria and Mali and elsewhere. And I think that I hope that the Security Council will take this experience and apply it to the other places so that it just becomes the norm. Peace builders are part of peace talks. That's kind of sounds pretty basic, right?
Thank you, Sanam. Okay, I think I would like to go back to where we started initially with our focus on the Security Council and Norway as a member there, and what Norway possibly can do to further advance this agenda. And many of you have been briefly mentioning the importance of building coalitions. That it's difficult to walk this alone, that you need allies. And as far as I know, there are now, with the new members joining the Security Council, the new elected ones in January, there are now 8 members of the UN Security Council that are also members of this Friends group of women, peace and security. So they have actually made commitments to advance this agenda. What kind of difference do you think that will make now for the year or the years to come, that you seem to have a very strong coalition of committed states? I'm just asking openly the questions. I don't know who would like to maybe respond first. Maybe if I could put you, Louise, on the spot, since you've been doing research on this.
Yeah, I think I was just going to add to that it's been when we've tracked over the last years, what has become clear is there's increasing tendencies by states to build almost formalized coalitions, and I think the 2 triads, or what do you like to call them, presidencies, where sort of states have sort of joined and not only sort of verbally agreed, but actually formalized it in writing and also stated it publicly what they want to achieve together on WPS is a really interesting development. I think it's also interesting that we've seen sort of increasing alliances and sort of really broad-based support for when you're trying to move forward on a particular resolution. I think the climate that Niels brought up was one such example where you really try to gather sort of the majority of the state behind one particular resolution suggestion in order to push or shame the people or the states that are against it to at least abstain, if so, not to reject it. Now that didn't work, but we see the same thing with WPS as well. And I think that goes perhaps a little bit to a point that I heard Niels also raise at both here but also at other seminars in terms of since elected states tend to be this short term. I mean, it's such a 2 years just flies by, even though I'm sure for André right now it doesn't feel like it's flying at all. But it's a fairly short time period to achieve your very ambitious aim in an extremely difficult environment. So what we have seen among elected states is then to try to build on each other, so it doesn't become this short game. You can actually try to build on each other and support and continue the work over time that can a little bit offset the permanent 5 sort of dominance in terms of dominating the procedures, etc. Thanks.
Sorry, does anyone want to add to that? Is this something that you have also seen in your own research, Niels, that countries are collaborating maybe with others before they join the council and start, you know, prepping those who are coming in?
Yes, I really think that this is a very important point. And we already have this in a way, in an informal way of collaboration between the Nordic states. So we can have a continued focus on the Security Council and topics on the Security Council agenda. So Sweden was part of the council in 2017, 2018, and then Norway now, and then Denmark is campaigning for a seat in 25, 26. So there's an exchange of information between these countries. And that is very helpful and very useful, because when you go into the council, all the cases are already running and you need to jump on that train and you need to be there and be ready to act. If you're not ready, the cases will run from you. And then also one point is that as an elected member, you are in many ways a one-shotter, while the permanent members are repeat players. So the stakes in any case for the elected member states are much higher than for the repeat players, because they know that this or the permanent 5, because they know that the case will come back to them and they will get another chance, and to change a little bit here and a little bit there, or even postpone it, whatever. But I was thinking that this Nordic informal collaboration, this could also be something that you, of course, countries could establish on topics and themes. So to have a much more continued focus on, probably there is already, because you had this group of 8 that you mentioned, Torun, but it could be more explicit in a way. Yeah, thanks.
André, please.
Thank you. No, I just want to comment briefly that, of course, when a crucial part of us being on the council is to work towards all other member states in this, groundwork that I was talking about happening before any product is dealt with, and the more members that are already on board with the agenda, the easier that task is, right? And the more we can focus on those countries that are difficult, and the more pressure we can also garner towards those countries. But then again, it's also, like I've often mentioned, like people are also, or countries are also in different stages of being on the agenda, right? So it doesn't mean that you're friends of the agenda all the way to the, these questions that deals with conflicts and states, and so we also have some issues with those that are fairly aligned, right? So there's still a lot of work to do, but I think it's a sign that things are also moving in a positive direction, and I think that we have absolutely seen clearly over 22 years. But currently, we also live in a world, like Sanam said, that is not becoming more peaceful at the moment. It's quite challenging. In terms of us having high goals, I would say that I'll always rather not reach a lofty goal than deliver on an easy one. So I think we should have high goals, and hopefully we will also continue to have that for this year as well.
Thanks, André. I see that there is a question for you now in the chat, so which is directed to you. But before you respond to that, Louise, you have asked for the floor.
Yeah, just to shortly add to that, in the sense that what I think also is interesting when you see that the increasing number of states that are positive to WPS, it also means that even though, of course, these issues are, of course, political, so all states will come at it with slightly different perspectives, but also bringing a lot of different kinds of experiences. So for Ireland, for example, coming in with its history of armed conflict and women's negotiation, the part of negotiations, other states coming in, for listening, for example, at Albania at the open debate on protecting participation, with its own history of sort of failing first to include women and then actually reiterating that in the new government taking new. It really brings depth to and credibility, as legitimacy of states and the credibility of states are so important for pushing certain issues. So these kind of alliances can also build up legitimacy for different sort of questioned areas of the agenda, depending on how it's played.
Thank you. Is this directly on Louise's last comment, Sanam? Yeah, okay. And take you first, and then André, you can respond to Kristin's question.
Just very quickly, just as a kind of slight historical note, you know, over the years, what I found interesting, and going back to Louise's point, is that the countries that have had experience of conflict or of conflict resolution, or understanding of what the human dimensions of war and peace are, have been much more forward-leaning than the big powers, right, in terms of participation. It was Namibia, it was Bangladesh, South Africa got it, right? It's interesting that when you look at the sort of how the agenda is bifurcated, and we have the sort of participation folks, and then the countries that have done a stronger push on the sexual violence questions, and the victim questions, it's the United States and the UK, right? So, and this is important because we are asking for transformation. Women around the world in war zones, women who are diverse backgrounds and so forth, are asking for transformation and saying we want a seat at the table. Whether you want to call it decolonization, whether you kind of got to call it ending sex, whatever but that's the thrust that they're coming forward with. And I think politically it's a much better approach, because you approach a country and you wag your finger and say, oh, you rape your women and you're terrible to them. They're not going to talk to you. You go in and you say, look at despite the crisis, look at what the women in your country are doing. They can't say no, or if they do, then you really know what you're dealing with, right? What your counterpart represents. We need to change if you want, the implicit racism that drives some of these things, and listen and work with the countries that really get why inclusion matters, what their experiences are. And basically, I think that we don't need new resolutions. We just need to drill down and make this real, case after case after case. The devil is now in the detail and in the processes and in the doing on the ground. 10 resolutions, I don't even know what the text of half of them are, and I keep up with them, and I'm helping to draft half of them, right? We don't need more language. We just need it to be realized systematically and value what's coming in from the non-P5 countries in a much more significant way. I think it's very important to have the small countries there.
Thanks, Sanam. You were talking about implementation and putting the words into practice, and the question in the chat for you, André, is also, and this will be the last one because we are coming to a close. But Kristin is asking, or referring to you mentioning participation as key to the implementation of this agenda, and if you, as Norway, will also now push the participation of women to the ministries of defense and NGOs, and I guess she's probably also thinking of, you know, as peacekeepers, and how you are going to do that.
Yes, and also, like it says, to UN headquarters and other UN agencies, and yes, we do, yes, and yes, and I think it's an interesting time because Guterres is just started his second term, and our common agenda is actually, you know, this topic of women participation runs neatly through that agenda. And I think we should expect, and we can expect, some movement on that within the UN. Absolutely, those are the signals that we are getting, because the UN have such a major role to play in showing how this works and taking decisions that puts more women in the forefront, so that they can also be part of normalizing women's participation. So the UN should absolutely be bold on this, and we push in every context where we meet UN or other institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, André. We have actually come to a close. I was thinking of giving all of you an opportunity to maybe give a small piece of advice, or what you would like for Norway to do now for the remaining of this 2-year period. If there is one thing that you would like that Norway maybe put special emphasis on when it comes to how to work with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And maybe I could also challenge you, André, because this is actually your last day as Special Advisor on Women, Peace and Security. So we are really grateful that you wanted to spend your last afternoon in this position with us. But maybe you also have a piece of advice or input to your colleagues as you are now moving on to new exciting adventures outside of the MFA. So I don't know, who would like to start? Sanam, should I put you on the spot? Very briefly, since we are running a little bit over time.
I'm having a moment of mourning that we're losing André, but hopefully gaining him in other ways, in other sectors. Advice to Norway for the next year: be bold. This is the future. This is what we are talking about is really the way peace diplomacy has to be done. There is no other way to actually do peace diplomacy if we're serious about peace. And Afghanistan is not over. Afghanistan is a litmus test, not only for Afghans, but around the world. And so, you know, here they have an ad that says what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in Afghanistan does not stay in Afghanistan. It has spilled over already into Asia. In terms of extremism, it's already spilled in terms of authoritarianism and the coup, you know, all the things that we're seeing right now, the unraveling of multilateralism and the discredited agenda of human rights and women's rights. We need Norway to continue to focus on what is happening to Afghan women now, and making sure that we contain it and actually provide a space and a country that is safe for people to live in. Otherwise, the refugee flows are going to be endless. So don't let the big powers drive the Afghan agenda. Keep it present. It's hugely important.
Is there one piece of advice you would like to give to Norway?
Sorry, it cut there.
What did you ask?
You couldn't hear me.
Yeah, just the critical sort of who are you directing the question to? That part
I was directing it to Niels. I was asking Niels,
thanks.
if you maybe have one,
Sure.
piece of advice that you would like to give to the MFA.
Sure, I would absolutely agree with the previous speaker about being bold, and I would also say that focus on implementation, land situations, get the push language into land situations, and continue to push for continue to have the focus on female briefers from the civil society to the Security Council. It's not necessarily getting a resolution or a presidential statement that is should be the goal, but also these other kind of things.
Thank you, Niels. Louise.
Yeah, building on that, I think sort of continuing this, first of all, sort of the continuing on developing this, the language and the narratives around the participation protection nexus, and also sort of normalizing the participation language, also nuancing and broadening and being quite specific, I think, about what groups of women are we talking about in this particular context, what are their specific problems and how are they addressing their own security, sort of being quite concrete, sort of helping the Security Council move forward on that language. And I think that is an example that came up at another event some time ago, that, I mean, people are on the ground, are reading these resolutions, they are listening to your statements, they know that you are watching and that you are discussing. So this is a really, really important point in itself. And the final point, I think, is also how can we also, from sort of in a research policy collaboration, think around how can we measure and follow up what the council actually does on the female briefers to the council, their advice and their sort of, is there a way we can help each other understand what happens to that information and how is it used? Because there, I think it's a little bit of a black box for us who are outside of the council. So that would be a really interesting way forward, also as a researcher. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Louise. And then, André, famous last words, a special representative on women, peace and security, at least for now.
That is pressure, you know. No, it's really it's sad for me because it's a role that I have truly enjoyed. It's a privilege to deal with this issue and be put in a situation where you could actually try to have some impact on something that is so important. And it then gives me great pleasure to say that Signe Gieland, who is now listening in here, she will replace me, and I'm so happy for that because she is knowledgeable on this. She will step right in there in March and continue where I am leaving off. And in terms of, I like what the others say about being bold, and I'm almost going to tweet talk this, because I would say that too many countries are bold on war. Norway should be bold on peace, and we must be bold on women, peace and security. Thank you.
That was a wonderful way of ending this webinar, I think. So it remains just for me then to thank you all, to all those who have been listening in or watching. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to all the great panelists. And Signe, if you are still with us listening, welcome as the new special representative on women, peace and security. And we are looking forward to collaborating with you. So thank you all, and I wish you all a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.